In this second lecture, I want to revisit the generalized description of research that we saw in Lecture 1 and see if we can't unpack from that something a little bit firmer to anchor our ideas of research, to see whether we can't extract some necessary conditions for identifying research. Now, we could either use this to say that we need, if we were successful, which of course we will be, if we could say that certain conditions must be present in order that we can create research, in order that we can do research, or we could perhaps use it diagnostically to say, well, are there certain conditions, are there certain criteria which, if we can find in an activity, perhaps indicate that this activity is research. So in Lecture 1, we ended up claiming that research has to have certain features. It has to focus on a specific issue, it has to be systematic, it has to be objective. Remember, this is objective in the philosophical sense in contrast to subjective, so something external to me, my thoughts and my feelings, something we can point to and share with others. It has to produce results which can be communicated, and it has to produce new knowledge. For a moment, we'll just stick with that expression as time goes along. In the lectures, we will unpack what that means exactly. And so we have to address the question, well, why does research have to do these things? And our objective, I think, is this idea of bridging. If you remember in Lecture 1, we talked at the beginning about a perceived difference, possibly an extreme polarity between academic research on the one hand and professional research, which is the context in which most of our professional doctorate students are going to be working, on the other. And in order to achieve the professional doctorate, we're going to have to satisfy academia, satisfy the university, that we have made a significant original contribution to knowledge and or its interpretation. That is a definition of what it is to get a doctorate in a university. So we have to understand, well, how is it that our practical professional activity is going to do that? So what I'm going to unpack here are a series of relationships that come from our generalized description and that we have reduced down to conditions that seem to be necessary conditions. Now, whether they're sufficient conditions is something that I've discussed elsewhere in literature, but for the moment let's just say they're necessary. So in other words, we are going to find these conditions in an activity that we can call research. And the first condition is that we need to have a question. Now, the reason we need to have a question is simply related to the fact that we are trying to get an answer. So there's a pair here. It's not just one thing, it's a pair. We can only come to an answer if we have asked something specific. An answer is always in relation to a question. An answer is something that satisfies the query that is inherent in the question. And there is a linkage between a question and an answer. It isn't that there is a question on the one hand and an answer on the other. Very often in a question, we find the clue as to how it can be answered. So philosophical questions, for example, are going to be investigated through philosophy. They are going to have philosophical answers. Scientific questions are going to have scientific procedures and are going to have scientific answers. So the location of the question, the nature of it, how it is phrased, indicates the way in which it needs to be answered. So already in understanding the question, in perceiving, well, this here is the question. In this text, in this discourse, in this activity, this is really the question that is being asked. Once we can identify that explicitly, we've got a clue already as to how or where we might find an answer, not necessarily how we're going to do it, but where we might find an answer. What sort of thing, what sort of response would make this question go away? And as I've already indicated in the way that I've talked about it, the thing that joins these two together, apart from the location that both question and answer will be scientific, will be philosophical, and so on, is the method, the means by which we will move from the question to the answer. So in a scientific inquiry, perhaps focusing on certain activities, certain experiments. In a business activity, we'll be looking at certain relationships and not others. So already in forming the question, not only have we to some extent located the answer, the style of the response that is going to be satisfying and allay our question, make it go away, but also where we should look and the kinds of things that we can do. In a broad sense, we are going to be interested in this activity, we are not going to be interested in that activity. And the amount of focus that comes from that is considerable. There is a lot, when we've identified the question, there are a lot of answers that we're not concerned with. There are a lot of methods that we are not concerned with. Now all of this little set of three related circles takes place in a context. It takes place in a context of consumption. And so questions are only going to be meaningful questions, significant questions to ask to a certain group of people, to a certain audience. So questions in the creative arts are perhaps only going to be of interest to people involved somehow in the creative arts, either as producers or consumers or managers. Questions that are burning questions in the creative arts may be of no consequence at all in other areas like sociology or surgery. This also helps to narrow the field considerably. And at this level, we have to say that the audience is an audience of those engaged with the subject, as I have said, involved with creative arts, for example. We can narrow it down even more than that. Because the professional doctorate is engaged in an academic activity, there is a subset of the audience of, in this case, creative arts, who are the creative arts community engaged with academic questions, with questions that are relevant within the university, not just within creative arts in the broader cultural domain. So with most research questions, I think the audience consists of two levels, a macro level, broadly speaking, within the culture, within the community, within the society, and this is the audience that research councils try to address. So they are looking for research that has impact more widely, that's worth spending public money on, for example. And then we have the more specialized audience, who are perhaps going to be the actual consumers of the research itself, the ones who are going to be in a position to evaluate, to criticize it, to critique it, because they are involved as researchers, as academics, who are in a position to criticize the process, to criticize whether this method would actually form a bridge between the question and the answer, the relevance of the activities that are being undertaken. drawing it in this way allows us to identify where knowledge is going to be found, this new knowledge that we're looking for. It's going to be part of the answer, but it's going to be the part of the answer that satisfies our more specialized community. So we have to satisfy, ultimately, the examiner for our doctoral thesis. We have to satisfy the university that we have met their definition of the doctorate, making an original contribution to knowledge or its interpretation. But it's also constrained by the nature of the question and by the method that produced it. So what we've identified, describing it this way, are 4 named conditions that are linked together and that stand out as being more important in the activities that we undertake than some of the other things that we could describe. So in the real-world situation in which we have personal and professional relationships, in which we have a workplace, in which we have a certain budget, certain constraints upon what we do, in which we bring certain knowledge and experience to bear. All of this forms the context, the very complex web of factors that make us who we are, that establish our professional relationships, establish what we see in the world as having potential for inquiry. And in that, we identify a question. We focus on one little point. We also identify where an answer might lie. It's going to lie within our field of expertise, within our potential vision. We need to be able to get there. If we are designers, we're not going to find an answer in surgery or astronomy, probably. We're going to have certain methods that are at our disposal. Of course, we're going to learn new methods, but all of this, there are limits to what we're going to see as potential methods. It's going to build on our previous experience, our understanding, the tools we already have. And we have this audience. We, of course, are part of the audience. We perceive the broader audience who are our peers in our professional environment. But we've also now introduced, through undertaking this as a doctoral study, a more specialized audience within the university. And so we're going to need to satisfy them as well. And it's not just within the university, but perhaps describing this a bit more broadly, this specialized community that was in the center of our diagram, we're in a situation in which there is an evolving body of expertise represented by people who have professional doctorates already, who are forming a new community of researchers who are not just academics in the university, but are perhaps more specialized than the practitioners and people working in the professional environment in general. And so we have a new concept of who this specialized audience is, whom we are trying to satisfy with our answers. Are they satisfied by what we propose as an answer? And these individual points, you'll see in the diagram that these are 4 out of a suggested greater number of points. So there are all sorts of things at our disposal, but which are the ones that we really, of necessity, need to concentrate on, of necessity that we need to link together? And my proposal to you is that these 4 are key. These 4, without these 4, we do not have the conditions for research. And if we're looking at at an activity and asking, is this research? If we can identify these 4 conditions, then I think we are well on the way to saying, yes, this activity is research and not something else. So this helps us a bit, I think, with the problematic relationship that I described in lecture 1, where on the one hand, on the left-hand side, we had this idea of practice generating questions, but not necessarily generating the means by which they might be answered. And on the other hand, the more radical claim of practice providing the methods and techniques for solving a situation, for solving a question or providing an answer to a question. So I think the relationship is not so much that it's going to lie on this spectrum from simply producing questions, that practice simply generates questions that we investigate using traditional academic techniques, to the other, that practice itself is research. That's not really the relationship that we need to look for, I think. It's the way in which the professional context provides this network and the way in which we can identify within what is done as a holistic practice that which constitutes the question, that which constitutes the method, that which constitutes the answer, and for whom, the audience.